What if every single choice you've ever made, every new beginning you've ever embarked upon, was witnessed by a single silent entity? An entity that sees not only the path you chose, but also the ghost of the life you abandoned. It watches the moment you accept a new job, and simultaneously sees the future you killed by not taking the other offer. It observes the first kiss of a new love, while also seeing the lonely years you would have spent if you had walked away. This isn't some modern philosophical paradox. This is the forgotten power of a Roman god. A god so ancient, so fundamental to the fabric of reality, that even Jupiter, the king of the gods, the wielder of the thunderbolt, had to acknowledge his supremacy. He was a god with two faces locked in opposite directions, one bearded and weathered, staring into the infinite abyss of the past, the other youthful and sharp, gazing into the terrifying, unwritten void of the future. He wasn't the god of the sun or the sea or the harvest. He was the god of the change itself, the god of the doorway, the god of the transition. His name was Janus, and the secret he guarded was considered so vital to the survival and dominance of the Roman Empire that they stamped his two-faced portrait on their very first coins, a constant reminder that he held the key not just to beginnings and endings, but to the flow of time itself. So what was this secret? What did the Romans understand about choice, consequence, and the nature of time that we have forgotten? And why has arguably the most important god in the entire Roman pantheon been almost completely erased from our modern world, save for a single month we named in his honor? To understand Janus, you have to forget everything you think you know about Roman mythology. Forget the soap opera drama of the gods on Mount Olympus. Most of those gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Neptune, they were imports. They were the Romanized versions of the Greek gods Zeus, Ares, Aphrodite, and Poseidon. They were characters in epic stories, flawed and relatable, driven by jealousy, lust, and anger. But Janus was different. He was not an import. He was purely, uniquely Roman, an original Italic deity from a time before Rome was even a shadow of the empire it would become. He had no Greek equivalent because the Greeks had no concept that could contain him. He wasn't a character in a story. He was a fundamental principle of the universe. Think of him not as a person but as a living, breathing law of physics. He was the divine embodiment of the in-between. He wasn't the day and he wasn't the night. He was the dawn and the dusk. He wasn't the room you were in or the room you were going to. He was the doorway itself. He was the first word of a sentence, the first note of a song, the first step of a journey. To the Romans, every beginning was a sacred and violent act. It required tearing a hole in the fabric of the present to create a future. And that act, that moment of transition, was governed by Janus. This is why, in Roman ritual, you always prayed to Janus first. Always. Before you made a plea to Jupiter for victory, before you prayed to Ceres for a good harvest, before you begged Mars for strength in battle, you had to ask for permission from Janus. Why? Because without his consent, your prayer couldn't even begin. It couldn't transition from silence into speech. It couldn't cross the threshold from your mind into the ears of the gods. He was the gatekeeper of the divine. To ignore him wasn't just rude, it was cosmically foolish. It was like trying to start a car without turning the key. You could shout at the engine all you want, but without that initial spark, you were going nowhere. His domain was absolute. The start of the day, the Iannua, the Latin word for door, from which we get his name. The first day of every month, known as the calends. And of course the first month of the year, Ianuarius, January, a month for looking back at the year that was, and looking forward to the year to come. A concept so powerful it has survived for over 2,000 years, even if we've forgotten the two-faced God who gave it to us. But his power stretched far beyond the calendar. He was the god of all gateways, both literal and metaphorical. City gates, the doors to private homes, the archways of victory, but also the gateway from childhood to adulthood, the transition from peace to war, the birth of a child, a portal from non-existence into life. The Romans believed Janus presided over them all. He was the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end rolled into one terrifying, all-seeing being. The origin of his worship is shrouded in the mists of Rome's own founding. According to the myth, Janus was actually a mortal king who reigned in Italy during a golden age of peace and prosperity, long before the Trojan War, long before Romulus and Remus. He was said to have welcomed the god Saturn when he was exiled from the heavens, sharing his kingdom, and in return, Saturn gifted him with an extraordinary power. the ability to see both the past and the future simultaneously. He became a god not through conquest or divine parentage, but through wisdom, the ultimate wisdom of understanding cause and effect in its totality. This divine insight made him an invaluable protector of early Rome. In one of the city's foundational legends, shortly after Romulus and his men founded their new settlement, they committed a notorious crime: the abduction of the Sabine women. They needed wives to populate their new city, so they invited the neighboring Sabine tribe to a festival and, at a signal, kidnapped all their young women. The Sabine king Titus Tatius was enraged. He raised an army and marched on Rome, seeking bloody revenge. The Sabine forces were fierce, and they managed to breach the city's defenses, pushing the Romans back towards their final stronghold on the Capitoline Hill. The fate of the fledgling city hung by a thread. The gates were broken, the enemy was pouring in, and all seemed lost. It was in this moment of absolute desperation that Janus intervened. As the Sabine warriors charged through the gate, a furious, scalding torrent of boiling water erupted from the ground at the entrance to the Roman Forum. The jet of volcanic sulfuric water blasted the invading army, scalding them, terrifying them, and forcing them into a full retreat. Rome was saved, not by a clash of swords or a brilliant military tactic, but by a divine miracle. The gateway to the city, the very domain of Janus, had become its salvation. In honor of this miracle, the Romans erected a special shrine in that very spot. It wasn't a temple in the traditional sense, but a freestanding ceremonial gateway known as the Janus Geminus, or the Twin Janus. It was a simple bronze structure with two doors, one at each end, and it became the single most important religious and political symbol in the entire Roman world. Its rituals were simple, but their meaning was profound. When the doors of the Janus Geminus were closed, it signified that the entire Roman world was at peace. When the doors were open, it meant that Rome was at war. The open doors symbolized that Janus himself had left his shrine and marched out onto the battlefield alongside the Roman legions. His presence was a promise of a successful beginning to the conflict, and a guarantee of a victorious end. Now think about the message this sent. Think about the psychology of an empire that builds a monument to peace that is almost never used. In the over 700 years of the Roman Republic and the subsequent Roman Empire, the doors of Janus were almost always open. Historians record that they were closed only a handful of times, for brief, fleeting moments of tranquility in a sea of constant, grinding warfare. The open doors became a permanent fixture of the Roman skyline, a constant, nagging reminder that the empire's default state was conflict. That peace was the exception, not the rule. It was a terrifyingly honest admission of their own nature. Every Roman, from the emperor down to the common soldier, understood that when those doors were open, the god of beginnings and endings was out there, on the frontiers, sanctioning their conquests and watching over the violent birth of their new world. He was the silent partner in their imperial ambition, the two-faced god who saw the glory of the empire they were building, and the rivers of blood they were spilling to create it. And at the very heart of this bloody enterprise, in the center of the Roman Forum, stood a simple, unassuming structure. It wasn't a grand temple like Jupiter's on the Capitoline Hill, nor was it a sprawling basilica. It was a small rectangular bronze shrine with a door at each end. This was the Temple of Janus Geminus, and it was arguably the most important building in the entire Roman world. It was the nation's barometer, its spiritual heartbeat, its on-off switch for civilization itself. Because these weren't just doors, they were the gates of war. When the gates were open, it meant Rome was at war. The legions were marching, the swords were drawn, and the Republic was fighting for its life, or for someone else's land. When the gates were closed, it meant that for a fleeting, miraculous moment, the entire Roman world was at peace. Every border was secure, every rebellion was crushed, every enemy was vanquished. Now think about that. For a civilization built on conquest, a people who defined themselves by the lands they subdued, what do you think was the default position for those gates? Open or closed? For the first 500 years of the Roman Republic, those gates were almost never ever closed. They stood perpetually open, a constant, gaping wound in the heart of the city, a symbol that somewhere men were dying in Rome's name. It was the normal state of affairs. War was business as usual. Peace was the exception. Peace was the myth. This tradition, like so many of Rome's foundational rituals, was said to have been started by a king. Not Romulus, the violent, fratricidal founder raised by a wolf, but his successor, a Sabine king named Numa Pompilius. Where Romulus was a man of the sword, Numa was a man of the spirit. He was a philosopher king before Plato ever conceived of the idea. Numa looked at the city Romulus had built, a city of warriors and refugees, and he saw that it could not survive on violence alone. A state founded in blood would drown in it. It needed laws. It needed a calendar. It needed gods and rituals that bound the people together, that gave them an identity beyond being a glorified gang of marauders. And so Numa turned to Janus. He understood that the most dangerous moment for any society is the transition from peace to war. It's a threshold that, once crossed, is almost impossible to uncross. He decreed that the gates of Janus would be the physical embodiment of that choice. In times of peace, the doors would be solemnly shut and barred, sealing the spirit of war inside. But when the state was threatened, when the call to arms was sounded, the consuls, in full military regalia, would march to the shrine. They would perform the sacrifices, utter the ancient prayers, and with all the gravity the moment demanded, they would swing the heavy bronze doors open. It was a declaration to the gods and to the world: Rome is marching. The act itself was a piece of psychological genius. It transformed the political decision to go to war into a sacred duty. Opening those gates meant unleashing a force that could not be easily contained. It told every citizen that the rules of normal life were suspended. The farmer would leave his field, the blacksmith his forge, and they would become soldiers. Janus presided over this transformation, this beginning of a new violent chapter in the life of every Roman. He was the god who stood on that terrible threshold, one face looking back at the peace being left behind, the other looking forward to the conflict to come. For centuries, this was the rhythm of Roman life. The gates were open for wars against the Etruscans, the Samnites, the Gauls. They stayed open through the brutal generation-spanning Punic Wars against Carthage, a conflict that nearly bled the Republic dry. There was a brief, almost apocryphal moment after that first war with Carthage where the gates were closed. For a year or two, the city held its breath, experiencing a peace it had not known for generations. But it was a false dawn. Soon enough, new enemies emerged, new territories needed to be pacified, and the gates creaked open once more. They would remain that way for another 200 years. Imagine living in a world like that. Imagine growing up in a city where the symbol of war was a permanent fixture of your daily life. Always open, always beckoning. It would create a specific kind of mindset, a belief that perpetual conflict was not just inevitable but natural. It was the Roman way. Peace was a temporary aberration, a bug in the system. War was the feature. Then came the man who would change everything. A man who would end a century of civil war, a bloodletting so catastrophic it tore the Republic apart at the seams. A man who would defeat Mark Antony and Cleopatra, consolidate all power in his own hands, and transform the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. His name was Octavian, but history would know him by the title the Senate bestowed upon him: Augustus. After his final victory at the Battle of Actium, Augustus returned to Rome not just as a triumphant general, but as the sole master of the known world. He had waded through the blood of his fellow Romans to get there. He had outmaneuvered, outfought, and outlived every rival, and now he needed to signal that his new era, this principate, would be different. He needed to tell the world that the chaos was over. He needed to close the gates. This was no simple act. It was a statement of almost unbelievable power and arrogance. Augustus was declaring that he, and he alone, had brought peace to the entire world. The ceremony was one of the most significant propaganda events in history. He claimed he closed the gates of Janus 3 times during his long reign, a feat unheard of, a claim that he had succeeded where centuries of consuls and generals had failed. He was not just a leader, he was a savior. The peace he inaugurated, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, would become the defining feature of his new empire. But here lies the profound, two-faced irony that is the very essence of Janus. To achieve this celebrated peace, Augustus had waged one of the most savage and destructive series of wars in Roman history. He had to kill the Republic to save the people. He had to become a monarch to end the infighting of the aristocrats. The peace he delivered was a peace born from absolute domination. Janus, the god of beginnings and endings, stood witness to it all. He saw the end of the Roman Republic, with all its chaotic, violent, and vibrant liberty. and he saw the beginning of the Roman Empire, with its enforced, orderly, and autocratic peace. One face looked back on the corpse of the old way, the other looked forward to the birth of the new. The closing of the gates wasn't just the end of a war. It was the end of an entire world and the beginning of another. It was the ultimate transition, the grandest threshold Rome had ever crossed. Janus was the god of that moment. He understood that every new beginning is a kind of death, and every ending is the seed of something new. And the peace that Augustus built, this Pax Romana, was founded on a mountain of skulls. Janus, with his dual vision, could see both the beautiful, peaceful garden and the bloody soil in which it was planted. And nowhere was this duality more physically present, more starkly real, than in the very heart of the Roman Forum itself. Not in a grand, pillared temple like those dedicated to Jupiter or Saturn, but in a small, unassuming bronze shrine known as the Janus Geminus. It wasn't really a building at all, more of a freestanding gateway, an ornate archway with heavy double doors at each end. It stood as a symbolic passageway, a literal transition point in the center of the Roman world. And through this simple structure, the entire spiritual state of the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, could be read like an open book. Because this was the home of the doors of war. The legend, as the Romans told it, began with their second king, Numa Pompilius. He was the complete opposite of his predecessor, the violent, wolf-suckled Romulus who had founded the city in blood by killing his own brother. Numa was a priest-king, a man of peace and law. He was credited with establishing Rome's most important religious institutions, creating the priestly colleges, and reforming the calendar. He was the man who took a chaotic warband of shepherds and bandits and began to forge them into a civilization. And his first, most symbolic act was to build the Janus Geminus and to close its doors. This act was a declaration. It was Numa telling his people, and the gods, that the chaotic, violent beginning, the era of Romulus, was over. A new era of peace, order, and law had begun. He established the tradition. When Rome was at peace, the doors of the Janus Geminus were to be barred shut. When Rome was at war, the doors were to be thrown open. Now that might sound completely backward to us. You close the gates when you're at war, right? You batten down the hatches. You open them for peace, for trade, for celebration. But the Romans saw it differently. Their logic was deeply spiritual. When the doors were open, it signified that Janus himself had gone out from his shrine to march with the armies, to watch over the soldiers on distant battlefields, to guide them through the perilous transition from campaign to victory. When the doors were closed, it meant Janus was home. He was locked inside the city, his divine presence safeguarding the peace within its walls. The chilling reality, the fact that truly defines the Roman soul, is how rarely those doors were ever closed. For 700 years after King Numa's reign, they were almost constantly open. Rome was a civilization built on conquest. War was its natural state of being. The opening of the doors wasn't a somber occasion. It was business as usual. It was the engine of the Republic humming to life. A generation of Romans could live and die without ever seeing those doors sealed. They were closed once briefly, in 235 BC after the brutal First Punic War with Carthage, a conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But the peace didn't last. The doors were thrown open again, and stayed open for 2 more centuries. Through the conquests of Greece, the destruction of Carthage, the subjugation of Gaul by Julius Caesar, through it all Janus was out with the legions. And then came Augustus. After decades of bloody civil war, after the Republic had torn itself apart, he finally brought stability. And what was one of his proudest achievements, the one he boasted about in his official autobiography, the Residential Gesti? He closed the doors of war. Not once but 3 separate times. This was an act of pure political genius. He wasn't just ending a war. He was performing a sacred ritual that hadn't been seen in 200 years. He was consciously, deliberately, echoing the legendary peace king Numa Pompilius. The message was clear and powerful. I am the new Numa. The chaos is over. I have brought back the golden age. The peace I have built is so profound, so total, that the god of transitions himself can finally come home to rest. It was the ultimate propaganda piece, a physical symbol of the Pax Romana he had established, a promise that the bloody beginnings of his reign had given way to a peaceful, stable future. But Janus's power wasn't confined to this one state shrine. He was everywhere. His true power was in his ubiquity. The very word for a gate or an archway in Latin was a Janus. The word for a door was a Iannua. Janus wasn't just the god of the gate. He was the god of every gate. Every single doorway in every home in the sprawling empire was a tiny, personal temple to him. Think about that. For a Roman, every time they crossed a threshold, they were performing a small act of worship. The entrance to your home, your domus, wasn't just a piece of architecture. It was a sacred boundary between the dangerous, chaotic world outside and the ordered, sacred space of your family within. It was a point of transition, and therefore it belonged to Janus. The head of the household, the paterfamilias, would offer a prayer to Janus every morning upon unsealing the front door, asking him to watch over the family as they went out into the world. And every evening, upon barring it shut, he would thank Janus for their safe return. The threshold was a place of immense supernatural power and potential danger. It's why Roman grooms would carry their brides over the threshold. A bride stumbling upon entering her new home for the first time was a terrifying omen, a sign that she had offended the spirit of the doorway, that she had displeased Janus on the most important transition of her life. His presence marked the beginning and the end of every single day, but it also marked the beginning and the end of life itself. He was there at birth, the gatekeeper who oversaw a soul's passage from the spirit world into our own. He was the one you prayed to for a safe delivery, for the baby to pass safely through that first most perilous doorway. And he was there at death, overseeing the soul's final transition out of the world of the living. He was the God of your first breath and your last sigh. He was the divine gatekeeper of all human experience, from the grand, earth-shaking decision to send legions to war, down to the quiet, intimate moment of a father closing his family's door for the night. He saw the beginning of the empire and the end of the republic. He saw the start of a marriage and the end of a life. He was the Alpha and the Omega of the Roman mind, present in every arch, every gate, every door. But his domain wasn't just limited to physical space. He wasn't just the god of doors you could walk through. His truest, most mind-bending power was as the gatekeeper of a dimension that no one can physically cross, but that all of us are constantly moving through. He was the god of the most fundamental transition of all, time itself. Every sunrise, every new month, every turn of the year. That was all Janus. And that is where his story transforms from a Roman deity into a concept that we still live with every single day. To understand how a two-faced god became the master of our calendar, you first have to understand the Roman relationship with time. For them, time wasn't just a passive ticking clock. It was a force, a wild, untamed river that could either carry you to prosperity or smash your civilization against the rocks. And like any wild force, the Romans believed you had to name it to tame it. You had to give it structure, impose order, and most importantly, you had to know where it began and where it ended. Before Janus truly took his place at the head of the year, the Roman calendar was, to put it mildly, a complete and utter mess. It was a 10-month system, a lunar calendar desperately trying to keep up with the solar year, and failing miserably. Think about the names of our own months for a second. September, October, November, December. Do you know what those mean in Latin? 7th month, 8th month, 9th month, and 10th month. But wait, you're thinking those are our 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th months. Exactly. That's the fossilized evidence of this ancient, broken calendar still rattling around in our modern lives. For the early Romans, the year didn't start on a cold January morning. It started in March. Martius, the month of Mars, the god of war. And that tells you everything you need to know about early Roman priorities. The year began when the snows melted and the campaigning season could start. It was a calendar for farmers and soldiers. It started with war and agriculture, and it ended 10 months later in December. So what happened after December? What about the time we now call January and February? Nothing. It was just winter. An unnamed, chaotic dead period that didn't even count. It was a gap between years. A void on the calendar. Imagine living in a world where for roughly 60 days, you were literally off the books, living in an untime between the end of one year and the beginning of the next. It was unpredictable. It was disorderly. It was, in a word, godless. And for a civilization as obsessed with order, ritual, and divine favor as Rome, this was unacceptable. This temporal anarchy could not stand. According to Roman legend, this is where their second king, the wise and pious Numa Pompilius, stepped in. Sometime around 700 BC, Numa decided to tame the calendar. He knew that to truly control the year, You had to account for every single day. You couldn't just leave a 2-month gap of chaos at the end. You had to close the loop. So he added 2 new months to the calendar, Januarius and Februarius, January and February. But Numa did something even more radical. He didn't just tack these months onto the end. He fundamentally restructured the Roman concept of the year itself. He looked at the 10-month calendar that began with Mars, the god of action, war, and bloodshed, and he saw a system that was fundamentally unbalanced. A year that begins with war is a year defined by conflict. Numa wanted a year that began with something more profound. He needed a starting point that wasn't about doing but about becoming. Not about the heat of battle but the quiet moment of decision. He needed a beginning that acknowledged the past while looking to the future. He needed a divine patron for the threshold of the year itself. And who is the god of thresholds? Who is the god of beginnings, of doorways, of looking both ways at once? Janus. Numa placed Januarius, the month of Janus, at the very beginning of the new 12-month calendar. This was a revolutionary act. He was making a statement. The Roman year would no longer begin with the call to war. It would begin with a moment of reflection and intention. It would start under the watchful eyes of the two-faced god. From now on, the first thing the Romans did each year was symbolically walk through a gateway, leaving the old year behind and stepping consciously into the new one. This is the origin of our new year. The reason we celebrate on January 1st isn't arbitrary. It's a direct inheritance from this religious and philosophical decision made by an ancient king. The very idea of a New Year's resolution, of looking back at the mistakes and triumphs of the past year while setting intentions for the future, is a perfect encapsulation of the spirit of Janus. It's a moment of transition, a personal doorway in time, and we all, knowingly or not, pay homage to this two-faced god every time we make a promise to ourselves as the clock strikes midnight. The name itself, Januarius, simply means the month of Janus, but its placement was everything. It reoriented the entire Roman worldview, and his influence didn't stop there. While January became his signature month, Janus's authority over beginnings was woven into the very fabric of the Roman month. Every single month, regardless of which god it was dedicated to, had a special day. The first day. This day was known as the calends, and the calends of every month were sacred to Janus. So, on March 1st, the calends of Mars, you'd make an offering to Janus first. On June 1st, the calends of Juno, you'd pray to Janus first. Before you could get to the business of the month, you had to pass through his gateway. You had to acknowledge the god of beginnings before you could begin anything. Imagine the psychological effect of this. 12 times a year, every Roman was reminded that every new phase of life, every new cycle, required a moment of transition. It was a constant rhythmic ritual that reinforced the idea that you can't just stumble into the future. You have to enter it deliberately. You have to honor the passage. This made Janus one of the most important gods in the daily life of a Roman. Even if he wasn't as flashy as Jupiter with his lightning bolts, or as terrifying as Mars on the battlefield, he was something more intimate, more fundamental. He was the god of your personal fresh starts, the prayer you muttered before starting a new business venture, the god you honored when your child was born, marking the beginning of a new life. He was the god of the first word of a speech and the first step on a journey. But as powerful as this new calendar was, it still had a problem. Numa's calendar was better, but it was still based on a flawed understanding of astronomy. A year isn't a neat 355 days. It's 365 and a quarter days. Over decades and then centuries, Numa's calendar began to drift, just like the one before it. The seasons became misaligned with the months. The spring festival of Flora might happen when it was still cold and barren. The harvest festivals might arrive before the crops were even ready. Once again, time was becoming untamed. The calendar, Rome's great instrument of order, was playing out of tune. The gap between human time and cosmic time was growing wider and wider, and by the 1st century BC, it had become a crisis. The calendar was off by nearly 3 months. Winter was happening in autumn. Summer was happening in spring. It was chaos, and fixing it would require more than a pious king. It would require the most powerful man in Rome, a man who was a brilliant general, a ruthless politician, and a high priest, the Pontifex Maximus. A man who understood that controlling the calendar was the ultimate expression of power. A man who would perform a surgery on time so profound that his version of the calendar is, with only minor tweaks, the one we still use today. That man was Gaius Julius Caesar, and his decision to reform the calendar would not only save it from collapse but would forever cement the legacy of the two-faced god, Janus, as the eternal gatekeeper of our year. By the time Julius Caesar rose to power, the Roman calendar was an absolute disaster. It wasn't just a little off. It was a weaponized, chaotic mess, careening wildly out of sync with the seasons. Imagine trying to plan your life when March, a spring month, suddenly falls in the middle of autumn. That was the reality. The calendar was supposed to have 355 days, with an extra intercalary month of 27 days added every 2 years or so to keep it aligned with the solar year. The problem was, the decision to add that month was left to a group of priests called the pontiffs. And politics, as it always does, got in the way. If the pontiffs wanted to keep their political allies in office a little longer, they'd simply add the extra month. If they wanted to shorten the term of an enemy, they'd conveniently forget to. It was a system ripe for corruption, and by the mid-1st century BC, it was thoroughly rotten. The calendar had drifted a staggering 3 months ahead of the seasons. Festivals were celebrated at the wrong time of year. Farmers didn't know when to plant their crops, and the entire rhythm of Roman life was broken. Time itself had become a tool for the powerful, a plaything for corrupt officials. Caesar saw this for what it was, a symptom of a sick and disordered republic. He was a man obsessed with order, with efficiency. He had spent years on campaign in Gaul and Britain, far from the petty squabbles of Rome, leading disciplined legions that moved with clockwork precision. To him, a broken calendar wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an embarrassment, a sign of weakness and decay at the very heart of Roman civilization. And if he was going to rebuild Rome in his own image, he needed to control the one thing that governs everything: time. His chance came during his famous affair in Egypt with Cleopatra. While there, he wasn't just captivated by the queen. He was captivated by Egyptian knowledge. Egypt, ancient and wise, had a far superior system. They used a solar calendar, based on the reliable, predictable journey of the sun. It had 365 days, with a leap day added every 4 years. It was simple, it was elegant, and most importantly, it was based on astronomy, not politics. It was based on truth. Caesar knew this was the answer. Upon his return to Rome, now as dictator with absolute power, he tasked the best astronomer he could find, Sosigenes of Alexandria, with a monumental job: fix time. The first step was a painful one. To get the calendar back in sync with the seasons, they had to perform a hard reset. They had to create one single monstrously long year to correct for all the accumulated chaos. That year, 46 BC, would go down in history as the year of confusion. Caesar and Sosigenes added not 1, but 2 extra months between November and December, on top of the intercalary month that was already due. The result was a year that lasted an unbelievable 445 days. Imagine the confusion for the average Roman. The year just kept going. It was a necessary, brutal correction, a kind of temporal surgery to save the patient. Caesar was essentially telling Rome, "We have been living a lie. This is the price we pay to align ourselves with reality once more." But the most critical decision was yet to come. Once the calendar was reset, where would the new year begin? For centuries, the Roman year had officially started in March, named for the god of war, Mars. It made sense for an agrarian and military society, the beginning of the planting season and the beginning of the campaign season. But by Caesar's time, this was already a relic. The actual machinery of government, the swearing in of the powerful consuls who led the republic, had long since been moved to the first day of the month of Januarius, January. This was Caesar's moment of genius. He could have started his new, perfect calendar in March, respecting ancient tradition. But Caesar wasn't interested in tradition. He was interested in power and symbolism. He made the radical choice to officially align the start of the calendar year with the start of the civil and political year. He decreed that the first day of the year would be, forevermore, January 1st. And in doing so, he made a profound statement. He wasn't just picking a date. He was picking a god. He was deliberately and consciously placing his new calendar, his new Rome, his new era, under the patronage of Janus, the two-faced god, the god of gates, of doorways, of transitions, the god who looks back at the past and forward to the future. Think about the message this sent. Caesar was closing the door on the chaotic, corrupt past of the Republic. He was opening a new gate to an ordered, stable future under his control. The old year of confusion was over. The new Julian era had begun. And who stands at that threshold? Janus. It was the ultimate piece of political branding. Every single time a Roman citizen marked the new year, they would be participating in Caesar's vision. They would be paying homage, consciously or not, to the god who symbolized exactly what Caesar claimed to be providing: a stable, well-managed transition into a new golden age. This single act transformed Janus's role in the Western world forever. Before Caesar, he was an important Roman deity, yes, but he was one among many. After Caesar's reform, he was inextricably linked to the very concept of a new year. His identity became fused with that single moment of renewal, of looking back on what was and looking forward to what will be. The abstract idea of a new beginning was now anchored to a specific day, a specific month, and a specific god. Caesar had taken the abstract, cosmic power of Janus and embedded it into the daily lives of every person in the empire, and every person who would inherit its legacy. He essentially made Janus the divine bouncer at the entrance to every new year. This is why, 2,000 years later, we still celebrate New Year's Day on January 1st. It's a direct, unbroken line back to one man's decision to wrestle time into submission and stamp it with the image of a two-faced god. Our resolutions, our parties, our countdowns, they are all echoes of Caesar's grand project. He didn't just reform a calendar, he redefined the beginning. He made Janus the eternal gatekeeper of our shared experience of time. But Caesar, for all his brilliance, was still a man. And his creation, the Julian calendar, was nearly perfect, but not quite. He and Sosigenes had made a tiny, almost imperceptible miscalculation in the length of the solar year. A difference of just 11 minutes and 14 seconds. Seemed like nothing, a rounding error, but time like interest compounds. And over the centuries, those 11 minutes a year began to add up, day by day, slowly, silently, pushing the calendar out of sync once again. A new chaos was brewing, a temporal time bomb set by Caesar himself, ticking away for over 1,000 years, waiting for the moment it would threaten to tear the fabric of the Christian world apart. And so the stage was set for a confrontation not of armies or empires, but of time itself. Caesar's calendar, the Julian calendar, was a marvel of its age, but it contained a fatal flaw, a tiny miscalculation, a rounding error of just 11 minutes and 14 seconds per year. It seems like nothing, right? A rounding error. What's 11 minutes? You lose more time than that scrolling through your phone before breakfast. But time like interest compounds, and over centuries those 11 minutes had piled up, one on top of the other, creating a silent, creeping debt against the sun. By the 16th century that debt had come due. The calendar was now off by a staggering 10 days. The vernal equinox, the first day of spring, which was supposed to land around March 21st, was now arriving on March 11th. Again, you might ask, who cares? So spring comes a little early on paper. But for the Christian world, this was not a quaint seasonal quirk. It was a theological crisis of the highest order, because the date of Easter, the most sacred day in the Christian faith, the celebration of the resurrection, was directly tied to the vernal equinox. Back in 325 AD, the First Council of Nicaea, the same council that established the core tenets of Christian doctrine, had decreed that Easter would be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon that occurs on or after the vernal equinox. It was a formula designed to anchor the holiest day to the celestial rhythm of the cosmos. But now, Caesar's flawed calendar was causing that anchor to drag. The Church was using the official, but incorrect, date of March 21st to calculate Easter, while the actual heavens, the sun and the moon, were operating on a completely different schedule. The holiest day of the year was drifting, becoming unmoored from the natural world it was meant to reflect. It was a quiet, insidious heresy written not in a book, but in the very pages of the calendar that governed every aspect of daily life. The fabric of the Christian world was indeed threatening to tear, as human time fell out of sync with God's time. Enter Pope Gregory XIII. He inherited a problem that had been kicked down the road for centuries. Everyone knew the calendar was broken. Scholars had pointed it out. Astronomers had warned of the growing discrepancy. But who could possibly fix it? To change the calendar was to change reality itself. It was a task of almost divine arrogance, an attempt to wrestle with the very mechanics of the solar system. It was a problem so immense, so politically and religiously charged, that most leaders simply chose to ignore it. But Gregory was different. He understood the stakes. This wasn't just about astronomy, it was about authority. the authority of the Church to correctly interpret not just Scripture, but the very heavens. In a time of schism and Reformation, with Protestantism challenging the Vatican's power across Europe, a broken calendar was a powerful symbol of a broken church. It was a constant daily reminder that Rome was out of step with reality. So, in the 1570s, Gregory did what great leaders do when faced with an impossible problem. He assembled a team. He put out a call to the most brilliant minds in Europe, astronomers, mathematicians, and theologians, to form a commission. Their task? To solve the riddle of the 11 minutes. To pay the temporal debt that had been accruing for over 1,500 years. And to create a new calendar, a perfect calendar that would last for millennia. The commission was led by a brilliant physician and astronomer named Aloysius Lilius. He was the architect, the visionary who devised the master plan. After his untimely death, the immense task of explaining, defending, and implementing the calculations fell to a German Jesuit mathematician named Christopher Clavius. Clavius was the Einstein of his day, a man whose intellect was so respected that he was called upon to perform the most complex intellectual surgery imaginable. For years they labored. They studied ancient astronomical tables, made new observations of the sun and stars, and ran endless calculations. They had to solve two problems. First, the immediate problem: how to correct the 10-day error that had already accumulated. Second, the long-term problem: how to stop the error from ever accumulating again. Their solution to the first problem was brutal. It was audacious. It was an act of temporal violence. The commission proposed that 10 days should be simply erased from existence. They would be surgically removed from the calendar, as if they had never happened. One day, people would go to sleep, and the next morning they would wake up 10 days in the future. It was a plan so radical it sounds like something out of science fiction. The solution to the second problem was a work of pure mathematical elegance. The Julian calendar's flaw was its leap year rule. A leap day every 4 years, no exceptions. It was simple but too generous. It added just a little too much time. The Commission's new rule was a subtle masterpiece. It kept the every 4 years rule, but added a crucial exception. A century year like 1700, 1800, or 1900 would not be a leap year unless it was divisible by 400. So the year 1600 was a leap year. 2000 was a leap year. But 1700, 1800, and 1900 were not. This tiny, ingenious tweak brought the calendar into near-perfect alignment with the solar year, reducing the error to a mere 26 seconds. It was a fix so precise that the new calendar would only be off by a single day after 3,300 years. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII, armed with his commission's work, issued a papal bull titled Inter Gravissimus, among the most serious. He was now acting as a new Janus, a modern gatekeeper of time. He was looking backward at the legacy of Caesar and the decree of Nicaea, acknowledging the error of the past. And he was looking forward, creating a new path, a new future for how humanity would measure its existence. He decreed that the new calendar, which would forever bear his name, the Gregorian calendar, would be adopted. And he set the date for the Great Leap Forward. The day after Thursday, October 4th, 1582, would not be Friday, October 5th. It would be Friday, October 15th. Imagine the sheer chaos, the confusion. Landlords demanded a full month's rent for a month that was 10 days shorter. Workers worried they would be cheated out of a week and a half of wages. Saints' days vanished. Birthdays disappeared. People were genuinely terrified that their lives were being shortened by 10 days by a stroke of the Pope's pen. It was the ultimate act of a Janus figure, slamming a door on one timeline and opening a gate onto another. The old broken rhythm was ended. A new, more accurate one had begun. But the Pope's authority, while absolute in Catholic nations like Italy, Spain, and Portugal, meant nothing in the burgeoning Protestant world. In England, in Germany, in the fledgling colonies of America, this was seen not as a scientific correction but as a Catholic plot, trick, an attempt by the papacy to impose its will on free nations and force them to bend to its timeline. They looked at this new calendar and saw not order but tyranny. And so, as the Catholic world jumped 10 days into the future, the Protestant world refused. They stayed behind. For the first time in history, the Christian world was deliberately and defiantly living on two separate timelines. A new kind of chaos was born, not from astronomical error but from human division. The two faces of Janus were now staring at two different worlds, one Catholic and Gregorian, the other Protestant and Julian, separated by 10 days of empty time, a gulf of suspicion, and a bitter religious feud that would tear the calendar and the world in two. For the Protestant nations of Europe, the Pope's decree wasn't a scientific correction. It was a declaration of war, a temporal invasion. To them, Pope Gregory XIII wasn't just the head of a rival church. He was, in the fiery rhetoric of the Reformation, the Antichrist himself. And now this figure of ultimate evil was trying to steal 10 days of their lives, to dictate the very flow of time from his throne in Rome. The reaction was not just suspicion. It was visceral, absolute rejection. To accept the Gregorian calendar was to accept papal authority. It was to admit that the Pope had dominion not just over souls, but over the sun and moon. It was, in their eyes, a surrender. And so the great temporal schism began. The world of Janus was cleaved in two. Catholic Spain, Portugal, France, and the Italian states vanished 10 days into the future overnight. They went to sleep on Thursday, October 4, 1582, and woke up on Friday, October 15th. But in Protestant England, the German principalities, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia, it was simply Friday, October 5th. Time itself was now a matter of faith. A letter sent from Paris to London would be dated 10 days ahead of its arrival, a ghostly message from a future that, for the English, hadn't happened yet. Imagine the chaos. A merchant in Amsterdam, using the old Julian calendar, agrees to deliver goods to a buyer in Catholic Antwerp on a specific date. But which date? Whose calendar do they use? A 10-day discrepancy could mean the difference between a profitable deal and a ruinous breach of contract. Treaties between nations became a minefield of temporal ambiguity. Marriage contracts, debt payments, military timetables, all were thrown into disarray. The two faces of Janus were no longer looking at the past and future. They were staring at two different, incompatible presents. In England, Queen Elizabeth I, a monarch who had been excommunicated by the Pope and declared a heretic, viewed the new calendar as nothing more than a popish plot. Her chief advisor and court astronomer, the brilliant John Dee, knew the Julian calendar was flawed. He had even proposed his own highly accurate reform to the Queen years earlier, a plan that would have corrected the drift by 11 days, not 10. But it was rejected. Why? Because it was seen as too similar to the Catholic plan. English pride and a deep-seated hatred of Rome meant they would rather be astronomically wrong than theologically aligned with the Pope. They chose to live in a state of scientific error out of pure, defiant principle. This defiance sailed across the Atlantic. The American colonies, being overwhelmingly Protestant and subjects of the English crown, inherited this temporal stubbornness. For a century and a half, while the Catholic world operated on a more accurate timeline, the future United States, from the Puritan settlements in Massachusetts to the plantations of Virginia, clung to the old, inaccurate Julian calendar. George Washington, for example, was born on February 11, 1731, according to the calendar in use at the time. We now celebrate his birthday on February 22, 1732. He has two birthdays, a phantom of the calendar wars. The very foundations of America were being laid on a timeline that was out of sync with much of the world. For 170 years, Great Britain and its colonies remained 10, and eventually 11, days behind Catholic Europe. The vernal equinox, the anchor point of the calendar, kept drifting. Easter, meant to be the first Sunday after the first full moon of spring, was falling deeper and deeper into winter. The problem was no longer theoretical. It was a visible, seasonal absurdity. By the mid-18th century, the pressure to conform was immense. Trade science and simple common sense demanded a change. Finally, in 1752, Parliament passed the Calendar Act. Britain and its American colonies would finally make the leap. But it was a messy, painful, and deeply unpopular process. First, they had to realign the start of the year. For centuries, England had celebrated New Year's Day on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation. So, the year 1751 was surgically shortened. It began on March 25th and ended just a few months later on December 31st. An entire year with no January, no February, and only a sliver of March. But the real shock came the following September. To finally align with the Gregorian system, the government decreed that Wednesday, September 2, 1752, would be followed immediately by Thursday, September 14th. 11 days were simply erased, plucked from existence by an act of Parliament. For the common person, this was incomprehensible. Felt like theft. Not just theft of time, but theft of life. People went to bed on a Wednesday night and woke up 2 weeks later on a Thursday morning. A popular myth, likely exaggerated but rooted in genuine unrest, tells of riots in the streets. Mobs supposedly gathered, chanting a now famous slogan, "Give us our 11 days." They believed the government, in collusion with landlords and employers, had stolen nearly 2 weeks of their lives to cheat them out of wages and charge them a full month's rent for a 3-week month. They feared they would die 11 days sooner. It was a visceral primal fear, a protest against the abstract power of the state to literally manipulate reality. Benjamin Franklin, ever the pragmatist, tried to calm the public. He wrote in his Poor Richard's Almanac, "Be not astonished, nor look with scorn, dear reader, at such a deduction of days, nor regret as for the loss of so much time." But his calm reason was met with widespread confusion and anger. The transition was a social trauma, a moment when the abstract lines on a calendar had a real, tangible, and disturbing impact on everyday life. Other Protestant nations had their own chaotic journeys. The German and Dutch territories were a patchwork of dates, with Protestant and Catholic areas celebrating holidays weeks apart, sometimes within the same city. Sweden's attempt at a transition was a masterpiece of failure. Instead of dropping all the days at once, they decided to do it gradually, by simply skipping all leap years between 1700 and 1740. But they forgot to skip the leap year in 1704 and 1708. After a few years of this botched plan, the Swedish calendar was aligned with neither the Julian nor the Gregorian. It was a unique, isolated timeline, a lonely island in the sea of time. In 1712, they gave up entirely. To get back in sync with the old Julian calendar, they added an extra day to February, creating the only recorded instance in history of a February 30th. This messy, staggered adoption meant that for centuries, the world was a temporal kaleidoscope, a place where the date depended entirely on where you stood and who you prayed to. But even as Western and Central Europe slowly, painfully synchronized their clocks, one great power remained firmly rooted in the past. To the far east of the continent, the Russian Empire, bastion of the Orthodox Church, viewed both Catholicism and Protestantism with deep suspicion. The Russian Orthodox Church saw the Julian calendar not as a flawed scientific tool, but as a sacred tradition. To change it would be a profound act of heresy. And so, as the 19th century turned into the 20th, Russia remained 13 days behind the rest of the industrialized world. This wasn't just a quirky historical footnote, it was a temporal time bomb. When Russian athletes competed in the 1908 London Olympics, they arrived 12 days late, because their country was still living in the Julian past. But the most world-shaking consequence of this temporal divide was yet to come. It would play out in the streets of Petrograd, in a moment that would redefine the 20th century. A revolution that the world would come to know by the name of a month that, for most of the world, had already passed. The Great October Socialist Revolution of 1917 didn't happen in October. It happened in November. The first shots of the communist future were fired from a Julian past, creating a paradox that would echo for 100 years. And so, the new world was born out of sync with itself. A revolution meant to catapult humanity into a clockwork future, meticulously planned, began by tripping over the past. This wasn't just a clerical error. It was a profound statement about the nature of change. You can't build a new world without standing on the rubble of the old one, and sometimes that rubble includes the very way you measure your days. This desire to control the future by rewriting the past, by seizing control of the calendar itself, is one of humanity's most audacious and repeated power plays. And no one, absolutely no one, did it with more revolutionary fervor, more intellectual arrogance, and more spectacular failure than the French. 128 years before the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace, the French revolutionaries faced the same problem. They hadn't just overthrown a king. They believed they had overthrown history itself. They were creating a new man, a new society, based not on divine right and ancient bloodlines, but on pure unadulterated reason. And reason demanded a new clock. The Gregorian calendar, the one they were using, was hopelessly contaminated. Its years were counted from the birth of a Christian savior. Its months were named after Roman gods and emperors. Its weeks were punctuated by a Sabbath, a day of religious observance. To the architects of the new French Republic, this was unacceptable. It was like trying to build a gleaming new skyscraper on the foundations of a medieval dungeon. The old superstitions, the old power structures were baked into the very rhythm of life. To truly be free, time itself had to be liberated. And so, in 1793, they unveiled their masterpiece, the French Republican calendar. And it was aggressively rational. The year no longer began on January 1st. That was arbitrary, a relic. The new year one would begin on the autumnal equinox of 1792, the very day the Republic was proclaimed. A true beginning, a cosmic and political alignment. The 12 months were all renamed. Gone were the tributes to Janus, Mars, and Julius Caesar. The new names were poetic, drawn from nature, and designed by a poet named Fabre d'Eglantine. The autumn months were Vendemiaire, the month of the grape harvest; Brumaire, the month of fog; and Fermaire, the month of frost. Winter brought Nivose, the snowy month; Pluviose, the rainy; and Ventos, the windy. It was beautiful, logical, secular. But they didn't stop there. The obsession with logic went deeper. A month would have exactly 30 days. No more of this random 30, 31, 28-day nonsense. 12 months of 30 days gives you 360 days. To make up the difference, they added 5 special holidays at the end of the year, called the Sansculottides, dedicated to virtue, genius, labor, opinion, and rewards. A leap year added a 6th day, the day of the Revolution. But the most radical change, the one that would ultimately doom the entire project, was the week. The 7-day week, with its connection to Genesis and the Sabbath, was abolished. In its place came the decade, a 10-day week. 3 decades made one perfect 30-day month. The days weren't named Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They were named primidi, duodi, tridi, first day, second day, third day, all the way to decadi, the 10th day. This was the ultimate expression of the decimal system, the metric system applied to life itself. 10 hours in a day, 100 minutes in an hour, 100 seconds in a minute. It was a total rationalization of existence. And for the average person, it was a nightmare. Imagine you're a blacksmith in Lyon. For your entire life, for your father's life, and his father's before him, you worked 6 days and rested on the 7th. It was the rhythm of your body, the rhythm of your community. Now, the government in Paris tells you that you work 9 days and rest on the 10th. Your workload just increased dramatically. The market day, the day you sold your wares and saw your neighbors, is thrown into chaos. The church bells that mark the passage of time are silent. The saints' days that signaled the changing seasons are gone. The new calendar was supposed to connect people to the cycles of nature, the harvest, the frost, the rain. But in practice, it disconnected them from the cycles of their own lives. It was a calendar designed by intellectuals in a committee room, a top-down imposition of logic that ignored the messy, illogical, deeply ingrained habits of human culture. People resisted. They secretly observed the old Sunday. They continued to use the old saints' days to know when to plant their crops. The government tried to force compliance, making the 10th day, decadi, the official day for markets and marriages. But you can't force a rhythm. A rhythm has to be felt. The 7-day week, for whatever reason, be it religious, astronomical, or simply psychological, had a power that the 10-day decade could not break. It was too ingrained in the collective memory, the shared past that the revolutionaries were so desperate to erase. Janus, looking on, would have understood perfectly. The French revolutionaries were trying to build a god with only one face, a face that looked only forward, toward a utopian future of pure reason. They bricked up the doorway to the past, declaring it irrelevant. But the past isn't a separate country. It's the soil in which the present is rooted. By trying to sever that connection, their perfect rational system couldn't get the nourishment it needed to survive. After just 12 years, Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who understood power and symbolism better than most, scrapped the whole thing. On January 1, 1806, France officially returned to the Gregorian calendar. The month of fog and the month of frost faded back into poetry. The grand experiment was over. The past had won. The lesson is staggering. Even with the full force of a revolution, with the guillotine still fresh in public memory, they could not change the way people experience time. It proves that the calendar isn't just a tool for organizing our days. It is a story we tell ourselves, a shared narrative. And you can't just cancel a story that people have been living for centuries and expect them to immediately embrace your new one, no matter how logical it seems. We do this in our own lives all the time in smaller ways. We make a New Year's resolution. January 1st. This is year 1 of the new me. The past is over. I will go to the gym every day, I will stop eating junk food, I will become a new person. We draw a hard line, a door slamming shut on our old habits. But the old rhythms, the old cravings, the old memories are still there. The face of Janus looking backward is always present, reminding us of who we were. And more often than not, the pull of that past is stronger than our vision for the future. True change, lasting change, isn't about erasing the past. It's about integrating it. It's about acknowledging both faces, the person you were and the person you want to become. The French and the Russians tried to force a new beginning by decree. But as the 20th century wore on, humanity was building a new system of time unconsciously. A system not of governments and poets, but of engineers and programmers. A silent, invisible clockwork that would soon govern every aspect of modern life. And as the century drew to a close, we realized this new system had its own hidden, catastrophic flaw. A simple oversight, a tiny bit of truncated code, a failure to look far enough into the future, that threatened to send our entire civilization crashing back into the past. The world held its breath, waiting for the clocks to strike midnight, waiting to see if our digital future would be devoured by the two digits we had forgotten. 9. This was the year 2000 problem, the Y2K bug, the Millennium Bug. And it was perhaps the most perfect, terrifying, and globally unifying Janus moment in human history. It was a doorway unlike any other. Not made of wood or stone, but of code. Not a physical threshold, but a temporal one. A single second ticking over from 11 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds on December 31st, 1999 to the year 2000. And on the other side of that doorway we were told lay chaos. The fear was palpable. It wasn't the fear of an invading army or a natural disaster. It was a uniquely modern horror. The ghost in the machine we had built to run our world had finally come to collect its due. The logic was brutally simple. To save precious and expensive computer memory in the early days of programming, engineers had abbreviated 4-digit years to 2. 1975 became 75. 1983 became 83. But what would happen when the clock ticked over from 99? The computers, the silent, obedient engines of civilization, wouldn't see 2000. They would see 2000. And for countless systems, 2000 meant 1900. Suddenly, the entire planet was facing a temporal paradox of its own making. A 100-year regression. What did that mean practically? It meant everything. Power grids, which rely on precise date and time calculations for load balancing, could shut down. The lights of civilization could blink out city by city. The global financial system, a delicate web of transactions firing across the world in milliseconds, could collapse. A computer processing a mortgage payment might suddenly calculate 100 years of negative interest, wiping out a bank. Your credit card, with an expiration date of 01, would be seen as having expired in 1901. Your own birth date could suddenly place you as a 105-year-old infant. The predictions grew darker. Nuclear missile systems, it was feared, might interpret the date change as a system error or, even worse, a sign of attack, triggering their launch protocols. Air traffic control systems could fail, leaving thousands of planes flying blind in the sky. Life support systems in hospitals, programmed to run on precise schedules, could simply stop. The very supply chains that deliver food to our stores and medicine to our pharmacies could grind to a halt. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was the potential for a complete systemic breakdown of society. It was the two-faced god Janus presenting us with a bill. One face looked back at the hubris of the past, the short-sighted, pragmatic decisions of programmers decades ago. The other face looked forward into a future they never intended, an abyss of our own creation. Survivalist bunkers were sold out. People stockpiled canned goods, bottled water, and ammunition. The world's greatest technological achievement, the interconnected global network, was now seen as its greatest vulnerability. We were all connected, and so we would all fall together. This was the end of the world as we knew it. But then, humanity did something remarkable. We looked at the doorway. We saw the monsters on the other side. And instead of panicking and running, we decided to rebuild the threshold itself. What followed was one of the quietest, most monumental, and most successful collaborative efforts in the history of our species. It was a secret war, fought not on battlefields, but in the dusty server rooms and forgotten code archives of every major corporation and government on Earth. The cost was astronomical, estimated to be over 600 billion of today's dollars. Armies of programmers were mobilized. Many were retirees, the original authors of this code, called back into service like old gunslingers for one last showdown. They were the only ones who could still read the ancient texts of programming languages like COBOL and Fortran, the digital Latin upon which our modern world was built. They descended into the digital catacombs, line by line, sifting through billions of lines of code, searching for that two-digit demon. They were hunting for a ghost. Every system had to be checked. Banking, energy, transportation, military, healthcare. Nothing could be left to chance. Rival companies, normally locked in brutal competition, shared information and solutions. Nations that viewed each other with suspicion collaborated on fixing their shared infrastructure. It was a race against time, a global project of unprecedented scale, all happening just beneath the surface of everyday life. We, the public, saw the scary headlines. They, the programmers, were performing open-heart surgery on a living civilization. And then the night came, December 31st, 1999. It wasn't just a New Year's Eve party, it was a global vigil. In bunkers and command centers from the Pentagon to the Kremlin, engineers and leaders stood watch. As midnight swept across the globe, starting in the tiny island nation of Kiribati, the world held its breath. The first test. News crews broadcast live. The clocks ticked over. And nothing. A wave of cautious relief. Then New Zealand. Nothing. Australia. A few minor glitches at bus ticket validators, but nothing catastrophic. The wave of midnight continued its relentless march across the planet. Tokyo. Beijing. Moscow. The reports came in time zone by time zone. The power was on. The banks were solvent. The planes were still in the air. By the time midnight struck in London, Paris, and Rome, the tension had turned into a kind of euphoric celebration. And when the ball dropped in Times Square, the roar of the crowd wasn't just for a new year or a new millennium. It was a collective sigh of relief, a cheer of victory. We had faced our own self-made apocalypse and we had won. In the weeks that followed, a new narrative emerged. The cynics began to crow. The Y2K bug was a hoax. It was all hype, a scheme by consultants and programmers to make billions. But they had it completely backward. The reason the world didn't end was not because the threat was fake. The reason the world didn't end is because we fixed it. The disaster didn't happen because, for once, humanity saw the crisis coming. We stood at the threshold of Janus and we paid the toll. We looked backward, acknowledged the mistakes of the past, and we dedicated immense resources to correcting them. We did the hard, unglamorous work required to ensure a safe passage. We honored both faces of the god. We looked at the end of our own creation and through foresight and cooperation, we engineered a new beginning. Y2K was the ultimate Janus gate, a global rite of passage that forced us to confront the delicate, interdependent nature of the world we had built. It proved that our greatest vulnerabilities were not external threats, but the forgotten consequences of our own cleverness. It was a stark reminder that every beginning is built upon the foundation of an ending, and that to step into the future, you must first be willing to honestly account for the past. This global doorway was a dramatic, once-in-a-millennium event. But the truth is, we all face these thresholds, these Janus gates, in our own lives every single day, in choices both small and monumental. And how we navigate them defines not just our future, but who we are. Think about the moment you wake up. In that brief, groggy space between sleep and awareness, you are standing in a gateway. Behind you is the world of dreams, the experiences of the day before, the entire history of your life that led you to that bed. In front of you is the blank slate of a new day, a landscape of choices, possibilities, and unforeseen challenges. That moment, that threshold, is the domain of Janus. Every morning you pass through one of his gates. We tend to think of life in terms of big, dramatic doors. Graduations, weddings, the birth of a child, the end of a career. And those are certainly Janus moments, where the past and future feel so distinct, so heavy with meaning. But the true, subtle genius of the Roman understanding of Janus is that these gates are everywhere. They are not just the grand arches of triumph, but the small, unmarked doors we pass through 100 times a day. Choosing to have that difficult conversation, you are standing in a Janus gate, looking back at the silence and forward to the potential outcome. Deciding to finally start that project you've been putting off, you are pushing open a door, leaving the world of procrastination behind and stepping into the world of action. Even the simple act of hitting send on an important email is a transition, a closing of one state, the draft, and the beginning of another, the waiting, the response, the consequences. In our modern world, we are surrounded by more Janus gates than any Roman could have ever imagined. The screen you're watching this on right now is one of the most powerful gateways ever created. With one face, it looks back, giving us access to the entire recorded history of humanity. Every book, every film, every piece of knowledge from the past. With the other face, it looks forward, connecting us in real time to billions of people, shaping future events, and building new virtual worlds. Every time you log on, you are stepping through a portal, a transition between your physical reality and a digital one, and you must choose which way you will face. This is the fundamental wisdom Janus offers us, a wisdom more relevant today than ever before. You cannot face the future without acknowledging the past. They are inextricably linked. He is not the God of forgetting the past to embrace the future. He is the God of seeing both simultaneously, of understanding that one informs the other. To make a wise decision about where you are going, you must have a clear-eyed view of where you have been. The past is not an anchor holding you back. It is the rudder that steers you forward. Its lessons, its triumphs, its scars. They are the data you need to navigate the uncharted waters ahead. Think of the addicts seeking recovery. They must look forward with hope to a future of sobriety. But to get there, they must also look back with unflinching honesty at the past that brought them to their knees. Both perspectives are essential. To ignore the past is to be doomed to repeat it. To be trapped by the past is to sacrifice the future. Janus stands in the middle, urging a balance, a complete vision. This is the great challenge of our time. We live in an age that is obsessed with the new, the next, the disruptive. We are encouraged to move fast and break things, to constantly look forward. Yet, at the same time, we are drowning in nostalgia, endlessly reliving past decades through media, fashion, and sequels. We are caught in a cultural tug-of-war, pulled between a frantic futurism and a sentimental past. We struggle to stand in the doorway, to see both ways at once. Perhaps the most universal modern ritual we have is a tribute to Janus, whether we realize it or not. Every December 31st, as the clock ticks towards midnight, the entire world pauses. We stand on the ultimate threshold. In those final moments of the year, what do? We look back. We reflect on the joys and sorrows, the successes and failures of the last 12 months. We remember who we were and what we've been through. Then, as the final second strikes, we erupt in celebration, and we look forward. We make resolutions. We set intentions. We kiss our loved ones and toast to the promise of the year to come. New Year, New Me. That single moment, the countdown, the ball drop, the stroke of midnight, is the modern closing and opening of the gates of Janus. It is a global act of acknowledging the past and consecrating the future. The true legacy of Janus, then, is not found in the ruins of the Roman Forum or in dusty mythology books. It is a living, breathing principle embedded in the very structure of our lives and our consciousness. He is the God of the second chance. He is the God of the clean slate that is never truly clean, because it is written on the foundation of everything that came before. He represents the profound truth that every ending is a new beginning, and every beginning is the result of an ending. They are two faces of the same moment, the same coin, the same God. You are the keeper of your own gates. Every choice you make is an act of passage. You have the power in any given moment to pause on the threshold, to look back with gratitude and understanding at the path that brought you here, and to look forward with intention and courage toward the path you wish to create. This is not just a lesson in history, it is a strategy for living. It is the awareness that you are constantly in a state of becoming, that the person you were a moment ago has already given way to the person you are now, who is in the process of becoming the person you will be. Janus, the two-faced God, the opener and the closer, the guardian of the gate, ultimately reveals that the most important threshold is the present moment. It is the only place where the past and the future meet. He is the silent witness to every choice, every change, every single heartbeat that separates what was from what will be. And in that sacred fleeting space between two breaths, that is where we truly live.